Good afternoon, everyone. A warm virtual welcome to you. My name is Suda David Wilp, and on behalf of the German Marshall Fund of the United States Berlin office, I'd like to welcome you to our second online Transatlantic Tuesday. We're doing our part to strengthen transatlantic relations and also flatten the curve. Thank you all for logging in. Today, we're really grateful to have our board member, former Senator Heidi Heitkamp, join us as our speaker to discuss the challenges that democracies are facing with fighting COVID-19. She will especially give her point of view as a former lawmaker. Senator Heidi Heitkamp served as the first female senator from North Dakota from 2013 to 2019. During her public service, she was always working across the aisle. She fought for working families and pushed for affordable health care, something that I'm sure will also come up in today's discussion. She is also the founder and chair of the One Country Project, an organization that focuses on addressing the needs and concerns of rural America. She's also a senior fellow at Brown University and a contributor to both CNBC and ABC News. Before I hand it over to my colleague Chiara Rosselli to moderate the discussion, I just want to go over the game plan for today. As we did so last time, you'll have the chance to ask questions of Senator Heitkamp. You just have to use the raise my hand icon, which you should be able to see at the bottom of your screen. And that will queue up your questions, and Chiara will pick on you to ask a question. Please unmute yourself and also introduce yourself, and note that this is being recorded. So make sure you keep that in mind when you introduce yourself and pose a question. And then you'll have a chance to ask a question. If you need the chat function, we will only use if there's a problem with the session. We will only use the raise my hand icon for the Q&A. So thank you very much for attending, and without further ado, I'm gonna pass it on to my colleague Chiara, who's the head of the Mercator European Dialogue at GMF, which is a network of European national parliamentarians, the perfect moderator for today's discussion. Take it away, Chiara.
Thank you very much, Suda, and for the very kind introduction. So today we have the pleasure of having this conversation about the impact of the corona crisis on democracy at large, and of course we will talk with Senator Heitkamp about how she sees it impacting certain important political trends in the US. But before I hand it over to the Senator, perhaps just a couple of words from my experience in the last couple of weeks. As my colleague introduced, as head of the Mercator European Dialogue, we work every day with politicians from across parties and across Europe. And what we are noticing is a real struggle to make sense of the crisis for politicians. And it's really it attacks politicians from different points of view, not only what measures need to be taken, but how to cooperate and coordinate such measures. Who should they be talking to is obviously a big question. And the third and perhaps most unprecedented of these challenges that is facing them today is how do they perform their functions in this situation. So we've seen, of course, the functions of parliaments being reduced here in Europe, and I believe that policymakers across the Atlantic are asking themselves essentially very existential questions about their roles and functions and how to best fulfill these in these times. Before again passing it to the Senator, I think the broader question, if we widen the lens a little bit from the policymaker perspective to the bigger question of today's Transatlantic Tuesday, I think what we're looking at is trying to understand better through our conversation, what should we be looking out for in terms of the impacts that this crisis has on democracy. And of course, there's the immediate term, but there's also a sense of this possibly being politically and culturally a historical moment that we are living. And what is this teaching us about our democracies? And what is it leaving behind? We've sort of seen already debates emerging about whether this is the renaissance of a more cooperative spirit or the opposite, whether this will mark a sort of revisiting of concepts of strengthened local governance. But I'm sure that we will get a chance to touch upon all of these different aspects in the next hour. And I would like to pass it over to the Senator with our kickoff question, which is a very simple one, I'm sure. What are the main challenges that COVID poses to democracy? Why? And in particular, obviously, looking at the United States. And then we'll take it from there.
I want to kind of start out maybe getting a mile-high view. When you look at the United States Constitution, Article 1 establishes the Congress. That wasn't a mistake. I think it was always in the minds of the founding fathers that the United States would basically be a country led by a constitutional government that would be fundamentally led by the Congress, establishing policies with an executive to have the responsibility to faithfully execute the laws of the land. And of course, the court took a much broader perspective after Marbury versus Madison, but we don't need to get into constitutional law here. But what I would say is COVID-19 has exacerbated a trend that we've already seen in democracies across the world, which is that executives are getting more powerful and legislative branches seem to be more dysfunctional, less able to be institutionally relevant going forward. And then you add to the mix in the United States a fairly autocratic leaning, unique leader in the leader of President Trump. And you have a formula that in a crisis like this really lends itself to amplify or magnify what is already, I think, a challenge for democracies across the country and across the globe. And so I think everybody should be very concerned. If you've been reading The Atlantic, you've been reading Anne's columns about concerns about pandemics and huge international and national challenges leading to more autocratic governments. What's also less talked about, but is definitely playing out here, is the United States is fundamentally a federalist government. What does that mean? We divide our power between state governments, which are protected by the 10th and 11th Amendments of our Constitution, and the federal government. Over a long period of time, especially since the Great Depression, you see, and since the Civil War, really, you see an erosion of states' rights. You see a movement towards a centralized kind of government. What's interesting in this is that people who typically look to a kind of strengthening federalist structures in the United States are seeing some criticism right now of the president by turfing this to state governments. And I think that there's an ongoing discussion, or there will be after this is over, what does our federalist system look like? Because I think the expectation among state leaders is, yes, we will make determinations on social distancing. We will make determinations on stay-at-home orders, but we need a central purchasing unit to lower the cost. I'm hearing things like 50-cent masks in Michigan are now costing $5 because the federal government in our country failed to insert itself in the supply chain. And you see a lot of people being very opportunistic. And so when that inevitable moment comes, when we do a look back and find out what happened during this time period, I think that there will be a broader discussion about what the rules are of federalism, which plays in our democracy quite significantly. I think the third thing that I guess I want to say is the interplay between the private enterprise system. What does this mean for capitalism writ large? Our system of government is founded on capitalism. It's founded on private property rights. Certainly being a Western representative and representing a Western state, that kind of individualism that you see maybe a little more prevalent in the Western side of our country is playing out. It's interesting because when you look at the free enterprise system, my daughter who asked this question, she said, you know, I've been told since I was a kid by you and Dad and by anyone who would give advice on financial security that you should have 2 months saved up so that if anything catastrophic happened, you'd be able to maintain your life, pay your bills, do whatever. She said, how come we never say that to private business? And so I think there's going to be a whole discussion, like there was after the financial crisis, a whole discussion about what was the lack of resiliency among American corporate businesses, whether it's our airlines, who I don't fault at all. I think that they are on the front line of this catastrophe, but there are other businesses that are failing right now because they did not have the business resiliency. And by the end of the day, we've got, I think it's $380 billion in something called Paycheck Protection program that is part of the CARES Act that Congress passed. That is going to be woefully anemic. And we're going to see, I think, billions of dollars going into small business. And so I think there's going to be, in the look back, a really broad discussion about what is that relationship between government and private business, especially in healthcare, especially in food security. And then on the other side, on the Democrat side, you're going to hear a lot about the failures of the safety net, whether that's paid family leave, which is, the United States is one of the only countries, developed countries, if I can use that term, in the world that does not have a uniform system of paid family leave. A number of states have adopted something like that, but we need a uniform system. Healthcare is going to be a huge issue, and the disparities we're seeing in healthcare. If you've been following the news now, the issue that's being confronted is the racial disparities between deaths because of COVID, and what does that mean for the equities of our system. So there's COVID-19 literally hasn't caused any of these discussions. It just has exacerbated and amplified the need to have these discussions, whether it is autocratic leaders, whether it is anemic legislative branches, whether it is, in fact, a less resilient private sector. I finally want to make a comment about American leadership, even though that's not on the front of America's minds. I think that I'm teaching a seminar right now in Brown, and I used this issue last week when I met with my students to talk about the kind of realignment of world leadership. As you look at China providing supplies and we can get into China, that would probably take another 5 hours of time to talk about it. But, I think that the question is the perception of America right now in the rest of the world and what that means in terms of, I would say, a retreat of American leadership on COVID. When you compare it to what we did on Ebola 6 years ago, it seems like we've exited the stage in a major international crisis in a way that we haven't exited the stage in the past. So I think there's going to be maybe an academic discussion about that, but it also, globalization will also be on the ballot, I think, this fall, especially as I anticipate that Joe Biden will be our nominee, and Joe Biden certainly comes from the John McCain, Joe Biden theory of America positioning globally. And so it'll be interesting to see what the follow-up is, but those would be the issues that I would raise in an academic setting, at least at this point. Are we frozen? Hello? I can hear somebody.
Hi there, Senator Heitkamp. I'm going to send Chiara a note. Maybe she's frozen, but I can still hear you, and I'm assuming that all the other people that are logged on could also hear us. But maybe we could talk a little bit about what you said about, your responsibility to the Constitution, but making sure that you're also working in a time of crisis. When you look at the stimulus package, or at least the crisis package that your former colleagues just voted for, what do you think about that? Was that the right thing to do at the time? Is it difficult to do these things, especially in light of not having really the time to look at the fine print? Will there be time for adjusting perhaps legislation that could also allow for loopholes down the road?
First off, I think that right after that legislation passed, Speaker Pelosi announced an oversight committee. So I think she knew that there probably were gaps in it. I actually, now that I'm quarantined and I have a little more time, I actually read a lot of the legislation, realizing that I'd probably be asked to comment along the way on various programs. I think it's interesting. In the perspective of the Democrats really needing to be very, very aggressive in getting money into the hands of individuals. And you see the Democrat-Republican split here. Republicans saying, let's just throw money at business and they'll keep employing people. And we've got literally full employment in the United States. As long as we're able to maintain that, we'll be ready to go. And that there's nothing really wrong with that philosophy. I think that made a lot of sense, and we'll see. But it also left the decision making to small business, who really don't have at this point the tools, and by that they don't know when this is going to end. So if you're a restaurant owner in New York City and you're trying to figure out, do I keep my employees on the payroll? Do I pay my rent? Do I pay my utilities so that I can reopen? You say, well, if I think it's going to be in a month, yeah. If I think it's going to be in 5 months, no. And so I think that it left a lot of decision making to small business that really didn't have the information that they needed to have. I was a proponent. I wrote a piece for CNBC. Anyone who wants to go out and look at it, this was my advice on what to do. I think that one of the mistakes that were made for individuals is we have systems in place in this country. Unemployment. We have Medicaid, which is a healthcare system for low-income individuals who can't afford their health insurance, which was amped up and amplified by the Affordable Care Act. We have a system for food security called SNAP or food stamps. And so what should have happened when people applied for unemployment is they should have been handed a Medicaid card so that they knew that they had health insurance. Chances are they weren't going to use it, so it wasn't going to cost the government a lot because higher cost individuals or elderly individuals, but it would have provided that family security. We haven't done enough on housing security in this package. And so I think that the tug and pull here in our country has really been about, do you provide a safety net for American business so they can continue to be the employers and provide these benefits, or do you provide a safety net for individuals? And you saw that play out. What we ended up with in CARES was really a hybrid. And I think there's going to be a huge debate when we're not in crisis, when the stock market's not falling, 20% against that backdrop, and you don't have millions of people filing for unemployment. It's going to be a huge discussion about what recovery looks like. I mean, this was a crisis package to cauterize the wound. I think now we're going to see a recovery package, and there's going to be big debate between whether you support individuals or whether you subsidize business.
And do you think
and the European model, as I understand it, has been very much helping businesses survive during the time of the pandemic. So, their experience will be relevant to what we do and follow up in this country.
Yeah, I mean, it's true. In Germany, they have something called short-term Kurzarbeit, where they give the employers the ability to pay their employees during the crisis. But I see that my colleague Chiara is back, so I am going to go behind the curtain and let her continue. If there is an issue again, I will pop back on the screen.
Okay, thanks.
Yes, thank you very, very much, Sudha, and sorry about that. Unfortunately, it's part of the implications of Corona. I'm not quite sure where we left off.
Basically ready for questions. I'm hoping everyone could hear the opening comments, because I think it kind of framed where we're at, maybe a little more academically than what people thought, but certainly when you look at the overwhelming kind of question, which I think is critically important, which is what's the future of liberal democracy in the world, and not just our country and not just Europe, but across the globe.
Thank you very much, Senator. I wasn't sure whether we'd moved on with the questions, but I think I hear from my colleagues that everyone heard you perfectly. It was just a problem on my side. So just to recap, there's a couple of bullet points you've highlighted, and I'm not quite sure where we can start off the discussion, because there's a lot to be discussed. We talked about sort of the creeping power of executives, the questioning of, well, what I would call multi-level governance in the United States, but of course, framing it in the broader perspective, we're seeing a similar sort of questioning at the European and EU level. We mentioned, or you mentioned, the challenge of rethinking, possibly question mark, the economic model, or rather, how is it resilient or not to shocks such as the one we are seeing. And the final point is that you made, I believe, is about the role of the US in general in the international order. So I think maybe to start us off with a slight diversion to then get back to it, because the question I believe on everyone's mind is, to what degree would you say that this crisis that is exacerbating, as you said, some problems that were pre-existing, how is it going to impact the presidential elections, if you had to say?
I mean, I think it's interesting, because at the beginning of the year, everybody thought that the presidential election would be about impeachment. And I said, it's never going to be about impeachment. It's going to be about what's happening 2 months before the election, and what leadership traits are being exhibited. I think that when you look at polling in the United States, and I do a lot of that in my work of teaching. I was looking at polling. The president that we have a. I mean, I'm sure this happens in your countries as well. It's something we call rally around the flag. In crisis, the leaders get higher marks. People are less critical. They're more willing to provide the benefit of the doubt. We saw that happen for the president. We saw a bump in his poll numbers, basically when he started addressing COVID-19 as a serious crisis and not a hoax. So then you saw, okay, we're going to give him the benefit of the doubt. But his message has been fairly erratic. And what's interesting is that it comes and goes in waves. Now, Gallup thinks that he's at 60% approval. That's not what other pollsters are saying. In fact, there's one poll that basically, Navigator poll, that does trend lines every day in this country, that tells us that for the first time, we're starting to see cracks in his solid base. He has enjoyed very high approval numbers and an intensity that would say that he has a very loyal following. 40% of people who are Trump supporters believe that he's mismanaged this. I think that it's going to depend on how long this goes on, and kind of what the follow-up is in terms of what will the stories be, what will the discussion be. Will it be about the failure of federal leadership? Will it be about whether there was fraud, waste, and abuse in the system? Will it be about congressmen, dealing with insider trading? And so I think my point would be, ask me in September, and I'll tell you what impact COVID will have on the election. One of the things that I do think it's impacting is the anticipation today that I think Senator Sanders sometime this week will suspend his presidential campaign, making Vice President Biden basically the presumptive nominee, which will then create a binary choice in the selection, and the comparisons will continue. What's interesting is something like COVID plays to Vice President Biden's strength. His strength is he's everybody's uncle. He's everybody's, you know, best friend. And he is one of the most empathetic people you're ever going to meet. And if the country's looking for someone who shares their pain, as we used to say in the Clinton years, you wouldn't look to this president. You would look to someone like Joe Biden to be the empathetic leader. And I think once Senator Sanders gets out of the race, I think that you will see President Obama reemerge as a major spokesperson for Joe Biden.
Okay. Thank you very much. That makes a lot of sense, especially the last point on empathy and looking towards more empathetic leaders. I think that will probably be an interesting trend. I don't want to take up more time, especially given the technical glitch I was a part of, and I'd like to ask, open it up to the floor right now for questions already. So as Sudha mentioned, please flag with your raise hand button and we will come to you. Okay, well, while I wait for questions to come in, perhaps, so that we, oh, there we go. Voila. Thomas Kleine-Brockhoff, please. See? Thomas, I don't think you're unmuted.
There you go.
There we go. Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Hi, Senator Thomas Kleine-Brockhoff, GMF. As nobody was asking, the first question, I wanted to break the ice. You were saying globalization will be on the ballot. That was an interesting comment. How so? Is it about decoupling, or is it about building in slack into the system of globalization, sort of in terms of security and resilience precautions? And how can it be on the ballot? And what do you foresee there?
I think the first thing I would say is if you look at the United States and you say, what did you expect would be the key issue coming into this election cycle? I would have told you it's healthcare. Healthcare and, you know, climate, taking a look at income inequality, kind of those kind of top line issues. This pandemic, in many ways, globalization was on the ballot in 2016 in the form of build the wall and trade disputes. And the president really went after what we would call the Reagan Democrats, the blue collar Democrats, by raising the issue of immigration, which the perception is they're taking your jobs and lowering your wages, and trade disputes, which you know, Mexico got all your jobs. That's why why the manufacturing isn't coming back. And so, you know, globalization was in a way on the ballot. Now what we're going to see is we're going to see a broader discussion, especially given that it's going to be Joe Biden, who is very much in the lane of John McCain and kind of the historic post-World War II, post-Cold War, you know, American cooperation. Not, you know, the question is, you know, the president has framed his foreign policy as America first. And that is really America alone, in my opinion. And I think that there's going to be a broader discussion in this election about trade, about pandemics, about cybersecurity, about all the things that threaten us and what we need to do. And in the central part of that discussion is going to be China. I don't think there's any doubt about it. The president thinks that's one place where he wins the debate. The pandemic originating in China adds to his the fuel to his fire that I'm trying to protect you against this global power. And I think that what the vice president's going to say is, yes, we have an emerging challenge, much greater than what we've had in the past, but we've abandoned our allies, and we need to reacquaint ourselves and re-engage with the European nations and not sanction them for being, under what we call 232 national security sanctions. And so I think that the whole discussion on foreign policy is going to center not around Afghanistan, not around Iraq, not around Iran. It's going to center around globalization and what's America's position in the future. And I think it's going to be an important discussion that we haven't had for a long time. The assumption that what's good for Europe, what's good for NATO is good for this country is no longer an assumption in the United States.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you very much, Senator. And Thomas, for breaking the ice. We have Sabrina Scharf up next. Please unmute yourself. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Senator. It takes a little while to unmute myself. My name is Sabrina Scharf. I work at Policy Planning at the German Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and I wanted to ask a question about the social impact the crisis might have inside the United States. So you mentioned how certain business owners are now desperately waiting for how long the crisis is going to take. They don't know how long they will be able to persist. So what I'm seeing and observing just as this as one example, that the most vulnerable groups will be the ones to suffer most from the crisis. And that might also, as you mentioned, exacerbate existing tensions inside the United States. Mm-hmm. So what uniting features or figures do you see either on the local or state level that might help to bring the country together?
Well, it's really interesting. Today on National Public Radio was, maybe a more muted debate between Congressman from New Orleans and the Senator from New Orleans. Congressman from New Orleans said, we see high rates of African Americans dying because we've had historic disparities and historic racism that we haven't addressed, to which the Senator argued, oh, no, it's just because they have diabetes and heart disease, which I kind of wanted to say, those are exactly kinds of disparities that we see with more chronic disease among lower income Americans who tend to be minority Americans. And so I think that there's going to be a long discussion. When we get the toll and we see that as a percentage, once again, people who live in poverty, people who from minority communities will have experienced high death rates, there's going to have to be a discussion about wealth and disparity. I mean, you look at my situation. Yes, I'm in the basement. Yes, I'm not traveling. I'm not able to work the way I work, but I'm working and I'm getting a paycheck. If you are an Uber driver, or if you're a food worker, you don't have that opportunity to basically earn a paycheck. And I think that in middle of this, here's a great example. We obviously, North Dakota is a large oil producing state. Obviously the oil price collapse has had a dramatic effect on our state, could have a very dramatic and adverse effect on North Dakota's or the United States' global energy industry. In the midst of this, one of the major companies, small independent, but major to North Dakota, company filed bankruptcy and gave their executives $14 million in bonuses before they did that. So it's going to be stories like that. It's going to be stories about a senator basically dumping stock after a briefing. It's going to be stories about Jeff Bezos selling Amazon stock before this happened. And the stories keep pouring out, and it's going to add to the anger that is already there about why is it that I live paycheck to paycheck and work as hard as what I can, and you aren't getting you aren't paying your fair share, and it was interesting because they said that if Jeff Bezos paid every person who is unemployed in America $10,000, he'd still have $80 billion. So I think that these are the kinds of discussions that are happening that you aren't seeing on the front line, but you're seeing in social media being played out. And those will percolate to the top once we get past the health crisis. We will then begin to address the economic disparities and the economic crisis. And I think something like COVID, I'm very concerned about my Native American reservations. We already see a huge outbreak in Navajo down in the southeast or southwest part of our country. Once again, poor health care. Once again, poor underlying, lots of chronic conditions that get exacerbated during COVID, and a lot of need to talk about the healthcare inequities in the United States. Whether we have that discussion, I think, depends on how this plays out in the end with the next couple tranches of relief packages. They will amp up all of this discussion.
Thank you very much. We have another question already lined up, so without further ado, Mike Cowburn. And it'll take a moment for him to unmute himself. We know that. Yes, just a reminder, Mike Cowburn, and please unmute yourself while we wait for him to come on. I think it's absolutely very interesting that what we're looking at is exactly a systemic crisis. But over to Mike, and maybe I'll be able to sneak a word in later.
Can you hear me now?
Perfectly. Go ahead.
Okay, cool. So, hi, Senator. So I'm a PhD candidate at the Freie Universität here in Berlin, specializing in US congressional primaries. So given my interest, my question relates to, so how do you think that COVID will impact the administration of US elections? So I'm thinking here particularly, given that elections in the US are administered by the states rather than in a federal manner that we might expect in European states. So yeah, I guess my question really is how do you think that's going to affect that? Not just, I'm thinking not just in 2020, but moving forward as well into future cycles.
I think first off, Mike, you I'm assuming we're watching what the Supreme Court did with Wisconsin yesterday, right?
Of course, that's kind of what's front of mind and kind of exactly what I'm
well, you're absolutely right. Elections are run by states. And as we see very often, if you're more of a state that is more inclined to suppress votes, you make voting harder. Yeah. And you make voting harder for people you don't want to vote. Working class people, minority people who, you know, in my state, when I ran, we ran into a huge problem with Native American populations not having street addresses and being disenfranchised that way. And so every state has a unique set of circumstances. I think at the end of the day, what I think is interesting about Wisconsin is people think, well, we've elected now a Democratic governor in Pennsylvania, and we all know if you follow American elections, the three states that basically swung towards Trump that made the difference in this election were Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. Yeah, I got them. Anyway, so when you look at those three states, they're now led by Democratic governors, which wasn't true in 2016. But they also are led by Republican legislators in Wisconsin, and that's been the challenge in Wisconsin. Michigan has in fact passed a no excuse absentee ballot, making it possible for everybody to vote. Pennsylvania has led the way in gerrymandering, which you should pay attention to the work that they've done in Pennsylvania. So every state is modeling a different kind of state-based behavior to broaden the franchise and make sure that equities are realized. And I think, you know, at the end of the day, what Nancy Pelosi wants, is she wants money to help states build in election security. This is driven, at least initially, by the Russian invasion or intrusion into American elections. And so Amy Klobuchar, Mark Warner, initially Burr was very interested in making sure that they had a bill that would protect the security of elections. And so in the next tranche, there's going to be money for states to have election security, hopefully, which Nancy tried to get into this last package. And the president kind of said the quiet words out loud, which is if everybody votes in America, Republicans will never win. There will be a big fight. And I think it's going to take more than one cycle to work through, but I would be surprised, quite honestly, if in the next 10 years we don't have vote by mail in every state in America. I just think it's a trend you can't stop.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree with you, and I think particularly you look at the voting lines in Wisconsin today, and you know it's crazy. And I think also,
this whole thing in Wisconsin is it is, and I haven't had a chance to read Justice Ginsburg's dissent, and I will do that. I haven't read the decision yet, but here again, what will drive what's significant about what happened in the Wisconsin decision beyond voting rights is how important the Supreme Court is, and it will once again inflame Democratic donors. It will once again put the court front row and center as an election issue in 2020.
Thank you very much. We have still time for a few extra questions, so please raise your hand. And in the meantime, I just wanted to go back to a point you made earlier, Senator, about how this is revealing to be quite a systemic crisis, and it will leave the US with a lot of big questions that need answering, right? And I was just wondering, for people on this side of the Atlantic, how do you envision cooperation with the EU on these bigger themes, and to what extent will it, this is not a question for now, but more in the medium term, of course, but to what extent will our way forward on these larger questions of economic systems and so on be shaped by the way we cooperate now on this crisis? And of course, I see just also the tension that policymakers have between delivering, so making sure that they are the ones delivering competence in this complex crisis, but at the same time having to square that with solidarity, whatever that means, whether within the US or at the European level or globally. I wonder if you could maybe react to that.
Well, I mean, I think it's interesting because obviously the president initiated a ban on European travel, and I'm not criticizing him for that, but he excluded the UK. Why? Because I think he sees himself politically more aligned with the Prime Minister Johnson in the UK. And some people argue because he's got golf courses there. I don't know. But my point would be that when you can explain a decision that you're making, whether it's sanctioning, putting tariffs on steel or putting tariffs on European goods, when you can explain those decisions as something other than retaliatory, you build relationships and opportunities to, I think, have a broader discussion. I think that I have a French national who is in my class at Brown, and he's been sending me articles from French newspapers, and there was a story about the president diverting PPE, personal protection equipment, away from France and to the United States, where Macron basically said, we're in this alone, we're going to become more nationalistic. And so I think in Europe, my question would be back to you, which is, are we going to be dealing with Europe, or are we going to be dealing once again in a broader sense with each individual country? And then you obviously have the challenge in Europe of what do you do with Hungary? Is Hungary still a liberal democracy? In the kind of in the model that we expect allied countries to be. And so I think the United States will have to do a lot of repair work, but will. I gave a speech recently to the Henry Jackson Society in Parliament, and basically I said, America First may not be, kind of the theme of American foreign policy, but it's also not going to be the same as what it was before this president. And so it's incumbent on the next administration, whether that's in 4 years or in a year, the next administration to help redefine and work back with our allies to try and, kind of reacquaint ourselves to why we're all in this together and why we've been in it together in the past. And so that restorative or reparative work needs to happen almost immediately after this election.
Yeah. I mean, the Hungary question is so broad that it would probably take another hour, but just as a quick reply on the front of who are we dealing with, I believe, like you're also hinting at, that we are still, it all depends on that restorative action, because also like publics in various member states have really, I think, reached the end of their rope, and there's still a lot of hope. And it's too early to say that the sort of union will not be able to get its act together on this one. But of course, as you will know, there's also a lot of there's a broad feeling that this is sort of the last attempt, because if not in this sort of a crisis, which is intrinsically very different from the financial crisis because of its motives, right?
Yeah, if I can just comment, I think that the longer institutions are around, the more we take them for granted. When they're new and we realize why those institutions exist, whether it's the common market morphing into the EU, or whether it is NATO, or whether it is, in fact, our constitution in this country, we have to go through a reintroduction, a re-discussion about what those institutions look like. In full disclosure, I'm a board member of something called Restore Democracy Initiative, which has a lot of really great, almost more conservative thinkers. As non-liberal as I am, I think I'm the token liberal on the board. But we spend a lot of time in that organization talking about not just what does this time mean for the American democracy, but how do we once again reestablish the commitment to liberal democracy, and how do we morph those institutions into something that's maybe a little more nimble and more appropriate for the 21st century. And so these are, but you can't be led, and okay, here's my one hyper-partisan argument. You can't be led by somebody who doesn't understand the institutions to begin with if you want to get that done. And, at least I think in Europe, there is a broader understanding about why those institutions exist. The question is, will they survive? Will that same belief system survive in the next 10 years, or are we just ahead of the curve in terms of our thinking in our country?
Thank you, Senator. I'm going to quickly go back to the floor because we have 2 questions lined up. Please, the floor now to Megan Richards, and unmute yourself kindly. Voila.
There, am I unmuted? I think it worked. Good, thank you very much. Very interesting discussion. I wanted to ask you a bit about the impact of COVID-19 on the economy, which has been disastrous all around the world. And I wondered how you see the reinvigoration of economies, both in Europe and America, but also around the world. Do you think there'll be pressure to go back to business as usual, to keep pumping out oil? You're in North Dakota, of course, which has all sorts of interesting shale oil issues along with the pipelines, etc. But given the price of oil, and I'm interested particularly in the energy-related aspects, do you think that this has the potential to make us change the way we run our economies and do things in a better, more sustainable way in the future? Or do you think there'll be so much pressure just to get people back in work, get things back to so-called normal, that we will go back to our old ways as before? Thanks.
Well, let's talk about oil, because I think it's a great metaphor. Just as people who have underlying challenges have a much higher level of challenge in a crisis, that's what's happening to oil. oil went into this crisis in a weakened condition. We were in an oversupply position. Obviously, Brazil is emerging as a major oil producer. They are going to be, along with Norway, joining the G20 for a discussion on what you do. OPEC, as anyone who understands American antitrust law, is not an institution that could survive legally in this country, even though now OPEC is asking America for basically production cuts. So let's just talk about why this is not going to be the savior for the oil industry. All this is going to do is delay the saturation of oil. So what we have right now is about 10% of the global oil storage is on boats floating in the oceans in this world. That's going to continue. There's going to be more and more pressure to put oil into storage so we can maintain the market. But that means that there's going to be a huge tail effect on pricing. So by that I mean, because you're storing oil at $20 to $25 a barrel, either somebody's going to make money when it comes out, and they will, or that oil is going to continue to, that oil supply being in place is going to continue to drive supply-demand curves and keep the price of oil lower for much longer. Now, the traditional thinking is that low-priced oil is bad for the renewable industry. It will delay movement towards renewables and sustainability kind of going in the future. I'm not sure that's true. When you look at the concern that I would have if I were an oil executive right now is that we're all talking here. We're not on planes flying to a conference. So what does this model look like in the future? What does the demand side look like in the future post-COVID? And I think it's going to be, we're going to see lower energy demand moving forward. And we're all seeing what's happening with CO2 emissions during this time. Maybe the winner in COVID-19 has really been the environment. And so there will be discussions about in that next tranche of assistance. So let's play this out in Congress. So you've got the oil states who have obviously written to the OPEC nations asking them to stop the price war. That makes sense because they're representing their constituencies. They're going to want something for oil in the next recovery package. In order to get that, you very much may have to do something for renewables in this country, or at least, as I've recommended, drive a aspirational, if not inspirational, CO2 measurement in the discussion. You want help for oil, you're going to have to agree that we have a problem with climate. And that's a big discussion that's going to play out. Just to give you for instance, in the United States, when I led the effort to open up US oil to international markets, we had a ban on exporting oil. In order to get that done, basically we stabilized something called the production tax credits and the investment tax credits. Investment tax credits are used by the solar energy industry and production tax credits by wind. That's why you see this massive investment in wind and solar in our country today. And so what I would say for all the people who this is an opportunity as the industry, as the fossil fuel industry is looking for a lifeline, this is an opportunity to drive decision making that may give you greater longer term benefits. But if you're an oil executive right now, your concern is twofold: oversupply and under demand. And under demand, I don't think is going to bounce back the way people look, and oversupply, because we're putting so much in storage, has a huge tail effect. And so I think you're going to see bankruptcies, especially among the small independent producers, like you haven't seen before, especially those who did not do hedging as a risk mitigation strategy.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Megan. Thank you very much, Senator. I'm just powering us through, because I want to get the last question in. It's from Payam Galedar. So there you go, fantastic. Please unmute yourself.
Thanks. My name is Payam Galedar. I'm a fellow at the Center for International Security at the Heidi School in Berlin. You, Senator, you mentioned quite vividly, described quite vividly the economic inequalities in the US. Now, looking at the candidates for the upcoming presidential election, there is obviously one candidate who for probably 40 years has been saying that nonstop, pointing to that and also offering solutions. And that is obviously Bernie Sanders. Now, tell us why you think, I mean, irrespective of the fact that he might be dropping out, as you mentioned as well, why you think that he might not be the right candidate for president. Thank you.
Because he's running at a time before COVID-19. He's running at a time when we have full employment, and almost 80% of the people in this country think the economy is working for him. So he's not running in a time of recession. He's running in a time when people feel like the system, even though there's income inequality, there isn't a high level of voting dissatisfaction. Now, for those of you who follow American politics, there's one economic indicator that a lot of kind of behind the scenes political pundits watch, and that's the University of Michigan consumer sentiment. And so Donald Trump still has, in the average of polls, an 11% advantage on his handling of the economy. The other thing is you've seen a precipitous drop, as it should be, in the consumer index, whether we should see a V-back in that, but he's had historic high numbers in the consumer index. And so I would say Bernie Sanders' timing is bad, because he was running probably his most likely campaign at a time when we had full employment, wages in the lower quartile, driven somewhat, I would argue, even though some economists don't, I would argue driven by Bernie's policies on increasing minimum wage. The wages in the higher quartile were actually rising at a higher percentage level than other quartiles in our economy, and people expressed satisfaction with where they were. And so I think it just is not the time for a revolution. But then you pair that against Joe Biden, which is, let's fix what we know we can fix. Paid family leave. Let's look at keeping our system as we understand it, but fixing the inequalities in the tax structure by leveling the playing field on earned versus unearned income, by not doing a wealth tax, which I would argue has huge challenges administratively. For full disclosure, I used to be the tax commissioner in North Dakota. I know a little bit about administering taxes. And so I would say that Bernie's timing, had this happened earlier and we had 20% unemployment coming into the election and Bernie were on the ballot, I'd say people would be ready for a revolution. They just weren't ready for a revolution in January. And you know that Bernie also can play such a significant role in the Congress. I don't know if you watched, and I would recommend to all of you, it's just Bernie at his best. When Lindsey Graham and Ben Sass, two of my former colleagues, tried to prevent people from getting $600 extra in unemployment, the lowest income people in this country, Bernie took to the floor and lit it up. And it's those examples that will drive incremental change. But the United States of America is not ready for an economic revolution in the way that Bernie talks. His followers are, but I don't think the United States is.
Thank you very much, Senator. An enormous richness of information and insights, a lot to digest. I think what is clear is that we have a lot of big open questions that will be popping up. And surely also what I'm taking away is a reinforced sense of alarm over sort of the encroaching executive, hour of the executive. So I think that's something also for us to sort of recap on, because it pertains very directly with the sort of state of health of our democracies. And with that, I think I'm passing it over to Suda for any last words. No?
Yes, apologies for all the technical glitches, but just to echo Chiara, thank you, Senator Heitkamp, for logging in from the great state of North Dakota. This was a great talk, and we look forward to having you come visit us in Berlin physically as well once the curve is behind us. Thank you, Chiara, for your moderation of today's discussion, and thank you all for logging in. This is a Berlin office initiative, Transatlantic Tuesday, but we also invited guests from Brussels through our Brussels office, so a shout out to my colleagues in Brussels. And we will continue this series with by inviting all our GMF office network in Europe to attend. So there will be other participants just outside of Berlin as well. Thanks so much, and tune in next month as well. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.